I never expected my biggest battle to take place in a quiet suburban neighborhood. After serving in the military for 2 decades, I thought I'd finally found peace in a home I could call my own. The streets were lined with well-kept houses, friendly neighbors waved from their driveways, and I could finally focus on my cybersecurity business without disruption. But there was one major problem: Karen Wilkins. She wasn't just any homeowner. She was the HOA president, a self-appointed ruler of our community. While most people joined the HOA to keep the neighborhood looking nice, Karen treated it like a dictatorship. If something didn't fit her idea of community aesthetics, she saw to it that it was removed, by force if necessary, and I was her latest target. My home office required a stable, high-speed internet connection to keep up with cybersecurity contracts. But living in a suburb, I knew there could be service interruptions. So I installed a small, FCC-compliant satellite dish, a move that, unbeknownst to me at the time, would ignite a full-scale war. The first sign of trouble came in the form of an aggressive letter from the HOA. "Your home is in violation of community standards. Remove the unauthorized satellite equipment within 48 hours or face escalating fines." I wasn't new to threats. I'd faced worse in combat zones. I responded with legal documentation proving my right to install the satellite dish. FCC regulations overrode HOA policies when it came to communication equipment. That should have been the end of it. But Karen, she didn't take no for an answer. At the next HOA meeting, I tried to present my case. Karen cut off my microphone mid-sentence. "We don't recognize federal interference in our community," she declared. Her loyal faction clapped like trained seals. I wasn't about to back down. I was within my legal rights. But Karen, she had a habit of making life miserable for those who resisted her control. The harassment started subtly. One of my clients' cars was towed for unauthorized parking, even though it was well within the visitor zone. Random inspections started happening, always finding violations on my property. Then my trash mysteriously disappeared before collection day, causing me to rack up HOA fines for leaving garbage bins out too long. I knew exactly what this was: organized intimidation. But the real attack came that fateful Thursday morning. I was on a high-stakes video call with a Pentagon contractor, a major cybersecurity assessment that had been weeks in the making. If I pulled it off, it would secure my business for years. That's when my screen froze. At first, I thought it was just a temporary glitch. But when I checked my internet connection, it was completely dead. Panic surged through me. I glanced outside, and there she was, Karen Wilkins, standing by the utility box near my property, wire cutters in hand. Even from a distance, I saw the red handles glinting in the sun. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a coincidence. This was deliberate sabotage. I barely had time to apologize to the Pentagon team before I grabbed my phone and bolted outside. By the time I reached the utility pole, she had just finished cutting the last connection. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded, pulling out my phone to record her. Karen whirled around, caught off guard. For the briefest moment, I saw fear in her eyes. But then she straightened her shoulders, her usual smug arrogance returning. "Your unauthorized equipment violates community standards," she snapped, gripping the wire cutters like a weapon. "I sent you multiple warnings. This is your final notice." I kept my cool, but my voice was deadly calm. "You just committed a federal crime," she scoffed. "Don't be dramatic. The board has the right to enforce compliance. Your monstrosity of a dish is bringing down property values." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I took a step closer, keeping my camera steady. "You do realize you didn't just cut my connection, right?" Karen's face twitched. "What are you talking about?" That's when the first angry neighbor appeared. "Is your internet down too?" called Mrs. Diaz from across the street, holding up her dead phone. More voices joined in. "Mine just cut out. I was in the middle of a work call. What the hell is going on?" Then came Mr. Peterson, our elderly neighbor who relied on a medical alert system. He wheeled himself forward, oxygen tank trailing behind him. "My monitoring system is offline," he said, voice hoarse with concern. "Backup battery only lasts a few hours." Karen's self-satisfied smirk vanished. The utility box she sabotaged wasn't just mine. She had cut power to an entire section of the neighborhood. And then, as if on cue, her own house went completely dark. Every light inside and outside, gone. No power, no internet, Meanwhile, my house, it was fully powered. Karen froze, her phone shaking in her hand as she tried to make a call. "This is an emergency," she shouted into her phone, panic creeping into her voice. "I need service restored immediately. Do you know who I am?" I just crossed my arms, watching the chaos unfold. Karen had finally outplayed herself, and this was just the beginning. Karen's face twisted with confusion as she looked between her dead phone screen and her pitch-black house. Meanwhile, my house was still glowing like a beacon in the dark. My backup generator, installed after years of military service and hurricane relief work, hummed steadily in my backyard. I'd spent my entire career preparing for worst-case scenarios. Karen, she had never prepared for consequences. A murmur spread through the crowd of gathering neighbors. Some held their phones up, recording Karen's public humiliation as she continued screaming into her useless phone. "This is impossible," she shouted, jabbing her finger at me. "You did this. What kind of illegal setup do you have in there?" I tilted my head, barely containing my amusement. "I didn't touch anything, Karen. You cut the lines. If anyone's to blame, it's you, Mrs. Diaz," the retired electrical engineer, had been inspecting the severed cables from a safe distance. Now she straightened with realization. "Karen," she said, her voice cool and professional, "you didn't just cut a single house's connection. You severed a primary distribution node. It means she knocked out half the damn neighborhood." Another neighbor finished for her. Karen's face drained of color. Her confidence was crumbling, and for once she had no control over the situation. She turned back to me, her eyes blazing. "You need to fix this now." I folded my arms. "Oh, you suddenly believe in government interference." A collective chuckle rippled through the crowd. That's when the first utility truck rolled in. A man in a work vest and a worn baseball cap climbed out, toolbox in hand. His name tag read Mike, and his expression darkened the moment he took in the damaged utility box. "Someone reported infrastructure damage?" Mike asked, his gaze landing on the mess of cut wires. I gestured toward Karen. "Yeah, our HOA president decided to enforce compliance with a pair of wire cutters." Karen puffed up immediately. "I was removing unauthorized equipment." Mike cut her off with a whistle. "Lady, you just tampered with critical infrastructure. That's a federal offense." Karen gaped. "That's ridiculous. This is HOA business." Mike let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. "Ma'am, I've been in this job for 20 years and this is a first. You just disabled service for dozens of homes and probably caused thousands of dollars in damages." Karen flushed deep red. "So just fix it already." Mike shot me a look. "Military, retired," I confirmed. "Same," he nodded, crouching near the severed cables. "Iraq 05, Kandahar 08, I replied. A moment of silent understanding passed between us, the kind that only veterans shared. Then Mike's expression hardened as he turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, you not only cut through multiple fiber optic lines, but you also fried the smart grid control node." The crowd gasped. "What does that mean?" someone asked. Mike sighed. "It means some houses still have power and some don't, because the system is trying to reroute energy through secondary pathways. But since this control node is down, it's a mess." "So how long will it take to fix?" another neighbor asked. Mike's jaw tightened. "Best case, 3 to 5 days before we get the internet back. Power will stabilize sooner, but expect rolling blackouts in the meantime." The groans were instant. "You mean I have to work from a coffee shop for the next week?" Lisa, a college professor, asked in disbelief. "I just lost an entire workday." Another man shouted. "I have a medical monitoring system," Mr. Peterson said, voice shaking. "How the hell am I supposed to live like this?" Karen's panic returned in full force. 3 to 5 days, she screeched. "That's unacceptable. I run a business from home." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. "That's exactly why I installed my satellite dish, Karen," I said, grinning. "Maybe you should have left well enough alone." More chuckles from the crowd. Karen's chest heaved with rage. "I'll have the HOA cover the cost of repairs," she declared. Mike's eyes darkened. "That won't be possible." Karen's brows furrowed. "Why not?" "Because this," Mike said, holding up one of the severed cables, "is a clear case of intentional damage. That falls under an intentional acts exclusion in most insurance policies, which means," I smirked, "Karen is personally liable for the full cost of repairs." The color drained from her face. No, that's ridiculous," she spluttered. "I already reported it," Mike added. "Legal's handling it now." The crowd muttered in disbelief. "So she's paying for this?" Lisa asked. Mike nodded. "The last case I saw like this, the guy had to pay upwards of $50,000. Karen staggered back, clutching her phone like a lifeline. That's when the police arrived. 2 police cruisers pulled into the cul-de-sac, their red and blue lights cutting through the night. Karen whirled toward me. "You called the police on me," I shrugged. "You committed a crime." Officer Ramirez, a no-nonsense Latina cop, stepped out of the first cruiser. "We received multiple reports of criminal damage to property," she announced, eyeing Karen's pale face. Karen pointed a shaky finger at me. "He's the one with unauthorized equipment." A man in a suit stepped out of the unmarked vehicle behind the police cruisers. He flipped open a badge. "Agent Harmon, Homeland Security Infrastructure Division." Karen visibly swayed. Homeland Security." Agent Harmon nodded grimly. "Tampering with telecommunications infrastructure falls under federal jurisdiction. Under U.S. Code Title 18, Section 1030, that could mean up to 20 years in prison if it affects critical services." The crowd fell silent. 20 years, Karen squeaked. "That's the max sentence," Harmon clarified. "But given that you disabled a medical monitoring system," he nodded toward Mr. Peterson. "This is serious." Officer Ramirez stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're detaining you for questioning regarding criminal damage to public utility property." Karen's voice shot up an octave. "You're arresting me for enforcing neighborhood standards." Ramirez ignored her. "You have the right to remain silent." Karen lost it. "I am the HOA president. You can't do this to me." Her tantrum was cut off as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Her husband, who had arrived minutes earlier, stood frozen on their driveway, watching helplessly. As Karen was escorted to the police cruiser, her neighbors, the very people she had tormented for years, cheered. Robert, our oldest resident, raised his cup of beer. To Karen, the HOA president who finally united the neighborhood against her, the crowd erupted into laughter. Meanwhile, I turned to Mike. "Think you can get my connection fixed first?" he grinned. "You got it, boss." As the police cruisers drove away, I watched Karen disappear, still screaming about HOA rights. She had finally pushed too far, and for the first time ever, she wasn't in control. Karen had been taken away, but her mess was just beginning. Even as the police cruisers disappeared down the street, the damage she caused remained. The neighborhood was still half in the dark, internet connections were down, and the consequences of her power trip with a pair of wire cutters were starting to crash down like an avalanche. And she wasn't here to weasel her way out of it. I could see her husband standing on their front porch, phone pressed to his ear. His face was a mask of stress and frustration. "Yes, I understand," he was saying, "but my wife didn't mean yes, I know. No, I'm not covering that cost." The call disconnected and he just stood there, rubbing his face, and then he turned and shut the door. Karen was on her own. By now, most of the neighborhood was out in their yards, whispering amongst themselves. Mrs. Diaz had taken it upon herself to explain to anyone who would listen just how bad Karen's mistake had been. She didn't just cut his house's internet, she said to a small group of neighbors. She took out an entire section of the block. That's why some people have power and some don't. She destroyed the distribution relay. "So wait," Susan, the college professor, piped up. "She didn't even know what she was cutting. She just started hacking away like a lunatic." Mrs. Diaz nodded grimly. "She had no idea what she was doing." Lisa groaned. "I was in the middle of my faculty review. You know how hard it was to explain why my Zoom call suddenly went dead." A father from down the street crossed his arms. "My kids were doing homework online when the Wi-Fi cut out. They lost an entire project they'd been working on all day. My medical alert system stopped working," Mr. Peterson reminded them. Slowly but surely, realization spread. The true weight of what Karen had done, how her reckless attempt at control had hurt everyone, was sinking in. And it didn't take long before frustration turned into action. "I say we hold an emergency HOA meeting," Robert said. "If she's locked up, it's the perfect time to." "She's not locked up yet," I cut in. "She's just being questioned." "Then we better make it fast." By the next evening, word had spread. The neighborhood gathered at the community center, a place that had previously been all but abandoned except for Karen's regular HOA meetings. Now, it was packed wall to wall. Even the people who usually avoided HOA drama had shown up. Because this time, it wasn't about Karen enforcing some petty rule about mailbox height. This time, she had actually damaged the neighborhood, and people were mad. Jim, our neighborhood accountant, stood at the front of the room, flipping through a thick HOA rulebook. "I've been going through the bylaws," he said, flipping to a section near the back. Article 8, Section 3, Emergency Removal of HOA Officers in Cases of Gross Misconduct or Criminal Charges. A wave of murmurs spread through the room. "So we can actually remove her?" Lisa asked. Jim nodded. "All it takes is a vote." "Then let's do it," Robert said, seconded. Mrs. Patel added immediately, "All in favor." Every hand in the room shot up, except for two, Karen's two most loyal board members. The retired lawyer and the former real estate agent sat stone-faced at the front. "This is unfair," the lawyer grumbled. "Karen hasn't even had a chance to defend herself." "She cut the damn power," someone called from the back. "There's nothing to defend," the lawyer pursed his lips. "The HOA charter says we must give her an opportunity to appeal." Jim flipped the page. "And it also says we don't have to wait if there's an ongoing criminal investigation," which there is. The retired lawyer's mouth clamped shut. Jim smiled. Then, by a 98% majority vote, Karen Wilkins is officially removed as HOA president. The room erupted into cheers. The very next morning, the utility company delivered its final report. It was worse than expected. Karen hadn't just cut through standard service lines. She had fried a control node that would take weeks to replace. The total cost of repairs, $47,000. And because it was an intentional act, HOA insurance wouldn't cover it. Karen was personally responsible for the entire bill. When she was released from police questioning later that afternoon, she found the bill taped to her front door. Her screams could be heard from 2 streets over. "This is a scam," she shrieked. "I won't pay a damn cent." I watched from my porch as she ripped the paper off her door, tore it into shreds, and stormed inside, her husband still nowhere to be seen. But I noticed something. There were moving boxes stacked in the garage. Karen's reign was over, and she knew it. A week later, the HOA held its first real meeting without Karen. Jim had been elected interim president, and his first order of business, suspending all aesthetic violation enforcement until we can revise the bylaws. The room erupted into applause. For the first time in years, people actually felt free. No more $200 fines for leaving trash cans out too long. No more petty citations for minor lawn decorations. The neighborhood belonged to the residents again. Karen. By the time the next meeting rolled around, her house had been put on the market. No announcement, no public sale, just a "for sale" sign that appeared overnight like a white flag of surrender. I never saw her in person again, but her husband. I caught him a few times, loading boxes into the trunk of their luxury SUV. He never looked up, never spoke to anyone. Just got in, drove away, and came back less and less until one day he never returned, and the next family moved in, a young couple. Nice people. Their first home improvement project, a satellite dish. "Hope this doesn't cause trouble with the HOA," the new homeowner joked nervously when we met. I grinned. Not anymore. Karen was gone, but the chaos she left behind, that was far from over. While most of the neighborhood celebrated her downfall, one problem remained. Karen wasn't the only one hungry for control. Her closest allies, the remaining HOA board members, weren't ready to surrender, and they had one last trick up their sleeve. 2 days after Karen's arrest, Jim, the newly elected HOA president, called for another community meeting. This time, the agenda was simple. What happens next? How do we fix the damage Karen caused? And most importantly, how do we stop something like this from happening again? We all gathered at the community center, expecting to vote on new HOA policies. But when Jim took the stage, his face was grim. "Before we begin," he said, gripping the microphone tightly, "I need to tell you something important." A hush fell over the crowd. "Last night," he continued, "Karen's remaining board members, Roger, Linda, and Sharon, held a private meeting. A murmur spread through the room. They called an emergency vote without notifying the community, and they tried to reinstate Karen as HOA president. The room erupted in outrage. "That's illegal," someone shouted. "She's under house arrest," another neighbor added. "They can't do that." Jim held up a hand, waiting for the room to quiet. "They tried," he said, "but they failed. Karen is legally banned from serving on any HOA board ever again." However, he took a deep breath. They also tried to push through a motion that would give full control of the HOA budget to just 3 people. The room fell silent. They wanted to seize control of the neighborhood's money without community oversight. And guess what? Jim pulled out a stack of printed emails. We have proof they were working with Karen. Even after she was arrested, they were still taking her orders. The community exploded in anger. This wasn't over. Karen was gone, but her power-hungry allies were still clinging to control. And now, we had to take them down too. The HOA had one final emergency meeting, and this time, we were prepared. Jim started by laying out the evidence, the private emails, the secret meetings, the obvious attempt to seize HOA funds. This, he said, holding up one final document, is our proposal. The entire board must be dissolved immediately. All remaining board members must step down. A new system of checks and balances will be put in place to prevent future abuse. It's time to put an end to this corrupt HOA once and for all. A wave of agreement swept through the room. No one wanted another Karen. No one wanted to deal with secret fines, backdoor meetings, or another HOA dictatorship. And so, with one final unanimous vote, the entire HOA board was officially removed. With no one left in charge, the HOA itself collapsed. For the first time in decades, Oak Ridge Estates was free from HOA rule. At first, it felt strange. No random fines, no mandatory meetings, no power-hungry board members telling us what color we could paint our houses. But then, people stepped up. Instead of fighting over HOA rules, the neighborhood actually started working together. The community center, once a place where Karen would host her power trips, became an actual gathering space. Mr. Peterson, the elderly veteran, helped organize a neighborhood safety watch. Lisa started a small community garden. Miguel, the widower, offered free home repairs to anyone who needed help. Oak Ridge Estates wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was an actual community. And the best part, no one missed the HOA. Not one bit. With the HOA gone, there was just one thing left to deal with: Karen's pending lawsuit. She had tried to avoid paying for the damages she caused, but the judge wasn't having it. She was ordered to pay every penny. The entire $47,000 utility bill came straight out of her pocket. And when she couldn't afford it, she was forced to sell her house. A for sale sign appeared on her lawn overnight, just like she had disappeared from the neighborhood. By the time she moved out, she was broke, humiliated, and completely powerless. And for the first time in years, Oak Ridge Estates was finally free.